Thank you for watching. Thank you for taking the time to invest in this series. As we look at the letters to the church, we're in 2 Corinthians. This is our second week in this letter, and we've been talking about 2 Corinthians using this description from Gary Millar, who's the principal of Queensland Theological College. He describes 2 Corinthians this way. 2 Corinthians shows us how to live by faith in our messy, broken world. It supplies the key to embracing our weakness and living in the strength which God Himself supplies. Last week, we looked at the comfort of God. And we talked about how God is the only source of comfort. That there are other things that we might turn to that might seem like they will bring relief, seem like they would bring some satisfaction, some comfort, but everything else is a mirage. Only God can bring comfort that endures and lasts and actually helps encourage us and bring us strength during times of suffering. The comfort that we receive from God is creating us to be comforters so that same comfort we receive from God we can share with others in any affliction. And as we talked about that last week, maybe you've never experienced God's comfort. Maybe the idea of it seems good and interesting and wonderful maybe, but if you've never experienced it, it might be hard to receive and long for it. I want you to know that God's comfort is a gift from Him that He longs to give you. But just like all of God's blessings, He doesn't force you to receive His comfort. He doesn't force you to receive rescue. He doesn't force you to receive mercy. But if we will humble ourselves and trust in His strength, not our own, He offers us this gift of comfort. Today, I want us to look at what could possibly be getting in the way of our receiving God's comfort. Paul wrote this entire letter, 2 Corinthians, right at the tail end of enduring some tremendous struggles and afflictions. This is our passage for today, 2 Corinthians 1, 8 and 9. Excuse me. We do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about the troubles we experienced in the province of Asia. We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt we had received the sentence of death, but this happened that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God who raised the dead. As we look at this passage for today, I want us to notice something. That as Paul writes this letter, his testimony, his authentic lived experience, tells the church in Corinth and us today, in the province of Asia, they were under great pressure. This is verse 8, far beyond our ability to endure. This is Paul, who has written much of what we have as the New Testament. This is Paul that met the resurrected Jesus on the way to Damascus. This is Paul that started this church. This is Paul who writes in such beautiful ways of explaining God and God's nature and our thinking and theology about God. And he says that the trouble and the pressure that they had in the province of Asia was far beyond their ability to endure. I want us to receive this and maybe for some free us from a false narrative that often gets repeated. It's a false statement about you and I, and it's a false statement about God. And it's not an awful statement. It's a statement that almost sounds good, and it's why it gets repeated, because we say it to one another when we are suffering. We say this false statement. We say, God will never give you more than you can endure. Have you heard that before? Maybe you've even said that. I want to free you from that. It's a false narrative. It is a false statement. It is not true about God. That's not his character or his nature. And it's not true about you or I. Our souls are not meant to endure, to carry the weight of grief and suffering and affliction. It is too much for us. This is what Paul is experiencing. This is his testimony in this letter to the church. We are under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure. So if we can shed that false narrative, shed the idea, let go of that, don't repeat that God will never give you more than you can endure, it is not true. We need God for every breath and for every step. We need to more fully understand that when we embrace our own brokenness, our own weakness, that we will discover that we can live in the strength of God, that we are not built or meant to endure the suffering, affliction, and pain that this sinful, broken world brings to every one of our stories. This is what Paul is revealing and teaching us here. He is testifying it was more than he could bear. And he goes on in verse 9, he says, so that we despaired of life itself, indeed we felt we had received the sentence of death. And this coming to the end of himself, physically, emotionally, spiritually, coming to the end of his rope. He has nothing left of his own strength, of his own resources, of his own wisdom, of his own will. He can't just keep trying harder. You can't just tuck his head down and say, I got this. He has come to the place where it is so crystal clear to him, this point of clarity, that this is more than I can endure or bear. And then he says this happened, this revelation happened. We felt we had received the sentence of death. This clarity of thought and revelation happened that we might not rely on ourselves, end of verse 9, that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. And right there is this opportunity for us to let go of a false statement that God will never give you more than you can endure, and embrace the truth that we need God's strength to endure every day. We need his grace. It's like fuel for us to burn through the day. We need his mercy. We need his wisdom. And boy, do we need his comfort. All other comforts will fail because they're a mirage, they're a counterfeit, they will not last. But we need the comfort of God. And part of the comfort is coming to the full realization, the acceptance of living life, not relying on our own strength, but relying on God who raises the dead. And Paul describes God this way because this is the power of our God. That no matter what we feel or what our circumstances are, no matter what happens to us in our mortal physical bodies, he is the God who will raise the dead. If we are his children, we have this eternal promise that no matter what happens to us, we are his and will be risen on the final day. That we rely on God, not on our own strength. Paul details some of his suffering in 2 Corinthians, and it's some of the most personal parts of his letters that he shares. And I want us to hear some of this suffering that he went through. This is 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 25. 3 times I was beaten with rods, once pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I've been constantly on the move, and I've been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false believers. I've labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. He's doing all of these things are happening to him while he is serving God. He is proclaiming the gospel of Jesus, and he is suffering these things in this list that he's giving us. 2 Corinthians 11:27, we continue. It says, I have labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst and have gone without food. And as he served for the work of the gospel, he says, I have been cold and naked, and beside everything else, I face daily the pressure of my concern for all the churches. This is a staggering list, but as we read the rest of the New Testament, we see that this is not a complete list of the suffering of Paul. And it's kind of astounding to think of this man who has had such an impact on the first churches and our churches today, such a strong leadership role in the foundation and the continuation of the church. And he's had all of this suffering, all of this trouble, all of these afflictions. When we look at a list like that, it's hard for us to connect, to relate. And this right here reveals one of the things that can be in the way of our receiving God's comfort. We can be in the way of receiving God's comfort if we use or try to use this tool of comparison. We really can't compare our suffering to Paul's. I've never been beaten with rods for preaching the gospel. I've never been shipwrecked. I've never been lost at sea. It's hard for us to compare our suffering to Paul's, and this can leave us kind of disconnected from the real person, the real experience, and we can miss his testimony that in his despair and his weakness, he discovered that he could only rely on the strength of God. And I want to have us consider today that comparison is not a useful mechanism in our spiritual growth. Comparison can get in the way of receiving blessings from God. It can get in the way of receiving comfort from God. And this is what I'm thinking about. If we would just consider comparison being a hindrance to our receiving God's comfort. When we function in comparison, we put ourselves at risk of being drawn in two directions. Comparison can lead us to pride. When we compare ourselves to other people or their situation, we can be led into pride that we are better than those people because we haven't struggled or suffered like that. We must be better than them. Or comparison can lead us to despair. We look at other people and we think it must be so easy for them. They don't understand how everything goes wrong for me. Everything is always more difficult for me. And we're left in despair. Both are equally devastating to our journey. Both can place us in danger of sin. Being prideful is a sin, and if comparison leads us to despair, we can walk in a place where we withhold love from our neighbor because it looks like they don't need anything. We're the ones that need it. Comparison is not a useful mechanism for us in our growth. And I would just push to encourage you that to consider this. If comparison is elevated as a virtue in your home, we risk being guided and controlled by the human doctrine of fairness, which is completely un-Christ-like. Christ is generous, not fair, and he doesn't treat us like our sins deserve. In comparison, feeds fairness, and comparison leads us to these places that hinder us receiving God's comfort. And if comparison is elevated, it can be a mechanism that holds you and your loved ones in this place of always being overwhelmed, always being discouraged, always being stuck in either pride or despair. Think about just examples of how this might work. If I compare myself to Paul, and let's say that I have a boat. I don't, but just for this example of maybe you have a boat and maybe you've been on the water all summer, and maybe you've had no trouble with shipwrecks, and you read this that Paul was shipwrecked 3 times. In comparison, you could be led to pride that you are a better sailor than Paul, and that kind of stuff only happens to Paul because he's inept. He's not very good at sailing, but you are, because you've never been in a shipwreck. So comparison can lead you to pride. It's just hopefully help us get a handle on a simple example. Comparison can lead us to despair when we might look across the street at our neighbor's house and it looks like everything's in order, looks like that roof never leaks. You imagine that their appliances always work. You never see their car in the garage, and their kids always seem well behaved. And I bet there's not a faucet in the whole house that drips. And they have it so easy. They don't understand what life is like for me in my house, because my stuff breaks and I have trouble and the milk spoils. I bet their milk never goes bad in their fridge. Comparison, whether it leads us to pride or leads us to despair, comparison answers questions of assumption. We make assumptions about what we're looking at, and we fill in the blank. And this is where we get trapped, because we ask questions from assumptions, and we either fill in the blank that I'm glad I'm not like those people, I'm so much better than them, or they have it so easy and it's always harder for me. We don't know the stories, we fill in with assumption. Comparison is a hindrance to receiving the blessings and comfort of God. And this is what I would like you to consider. Exchanging comparison for being searchable. Instead of comparison, which can lead to pride or despair, if we would be searchable, we'd be available to more fully receive God's comfort, God's strength, His mercy, those things only God can provide. When we are stuck in comparison, we are always fixing our thoughts on me. How does this affect me? How does this make me feel? But if we will exchange comparison for being searchable makes all of me available to all of God. And if I am available to all of God, then I am open to asking questions of my own heart during times of suffering. How am I responding to this suffering, this hardship, or this affliction? And how we answer this question reveals what can also be in the way of receiving comfort from God. So exchange comparison to being searchable, and we allow God to ask questions of our heart. When we read about Paul's suffering, he tells us he's at the end of himself. This is beyond what he could endure. We need to look at what Paul trusts at the end of himself. What gives Paul hope when he's at the point of despair? What could he turn to in times of extreme suffering? Paul writes this letter at the tail end of extreme suffering, and yet he begins it with these words of worship. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all of our affliction, so we'll be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. He wrote this letter after suffering these great perils in the province of Asia. And on top of his physical suffering and emotional suffering, he also had heartache because the church in Corinth began to criticize him. This church that he had founded and stayed with for 18 months and invested personally in deep relationships with people there, they brought a harsh criticism against Paul because he said he was going to return at a certain time, and then his travel plans changed. So they were offended that Paul said he would return, and then in their mind he didn't keep his promise. And they criticized Paul's integrity. I want us to think about how this criticism hurt Paul, because they got on a roll and they criticized his integrity. He said he'd do this and then he didn't. And then they start criticizing his preaching. You know, his letters are pretty strong, but when he speaks, it's not really great, not very good. He doesn't present himself very well. They start talking about his credentials. Maybe he doesn't really have the authority in the church that he claims. And they even talk about his appearance. That's not very impressive. If Paul's already at the point of being at the end of himself from the suffering physically that he's enduring and that he testifies to in our passage today, and on top of that, people that he loves, that he's invested and done life with, begin to question his integrity and question his authority, and even take shots at his skill at speaking and his appearance, how deeply wounded Paul would be. When Christians misunderstand one another, there's deep and painful wounds. And I want us to think about Paul being at the end of his rope and then having his heart hurt because people he loved and poured his life into started to criticize him in harsh and kind of brutal ways. So Paul responds in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 1. I made up my mind that I would not make another painful visit to you, he writes to the church. For if I grieve you, who is left to make me glad but you whom I have grieved? I wrote as I did so that when I came, I would not be distressed by those who should have made me rejoice. I had confidence in all of you that you would all share my joy. For I wrote you out of great distress and anguish of heart and with many tears, not to grieve you, but to let you know the depth of my love for you. This letter that he is describing, that he wrote out of anguish of heart and with many tears, is one of the letters that we don't have yet, we have not found. And when people talk about this letter, if you study this part of 2 Corinthians, scholars often call this the letter of tears. And for us, as we look at hindrances to receiving God's comfort, I want us to look at Paul and consider his testimony that he has endured to more than he can take. And it's clear to him that they're despairing even of life itself. And this revelation is that he can't rely on his own strength, but rely on God. That under this burden of stress, he has on top of this heartache from people he loves. And I want us to consider how Paul doesn't just lash out at these people. How he doesn't just lash out against these harsh criticisms. How out of his frustration and just physically being brought to the end of himself, that he doesn't just throw up his hands and lash out. And it's kind of amazing to think about. I want you to hear Paul when he says that he wrote out of deep anguish and with many tears, not to grieve you, but to let you know the depth of my love for you. When we are pressed in struggle and affliction, What's in our heart is what comes out. When we are pressed and struggle in affliction, what's in our heart is what comes out. What we see here is what was in Paul's heart under the greatest of anguish and enduring great suffering and having the heartbreak of people close to you harshly criticize you. When he was pressed in those ways, what came out of his heart is what he received from God. God's comfort, God's love, God's kindness, God's mercy, and the self-control from the Holy Spirit. This isn't Paul in his own strength trying to write words that somehow would calm these people down that were criticizing him. He is authentically pouring out his heart before these people, the people that he loves, that are so close to him, this church that he is longing to see grow and have impact for the kingdom. He just pours out his heart, and what's in his heart is what God gave him: comfort, gentleness, self-control, love, encouragement, mercy. This should be challenging, transforming for us to think about whatever is in your heart is what comes out when you're pressed. When we go through struggle and suffering, it does form us into the people we become, but it also reveals the people we are. If you are filled with anger, when you get pressed, when you get under pressure, when you're suffering, when you're hurting, then anger comes out. If that's what's in your heart, anger comes out, and it splashes on everyone and everything around you. Coworkers, loved ones, family, friends. If your heart is full of suspicion when you get pressed, when you're suffering, then distrust comes out. If your heart is filled with fear, then anxiety and fear comes out. If your heart is full of maybe a false narrative that you're always the victim, that bad things always happen to you, that life is never fair, then these lies come out. And we need to be challenged by the Holy Spirit that if our heart is full of garbage, when we are pressed and suffering, garbage is what comes out. And it rains down on everyone around you. So how does Paul endure such pressure, harsh criticism from the church family, direct opposition to his authority, to the church he helped to start, the misunderstandings of Christians serving in that church, the misunderstandings of his motives, the questioning of his integrity? How does he not just explode? What comes out of Paul is what is in his heart, what he's received from God. And what he's received from God is comfort. And if God isn't in your heart, the things of God will not come out of your heart when you're pressed. And the good news is that you and I get to participate in what gets to fill our heart. If you've not received the comfort of God, then you cannot give the comfort of God. I want us today to consider the ways to shed these obstacles to receiving God's comfort, that we would exchange comparison for being searchable, and that in being searchable, we would be able to ask spiritually and emotionally true questions of our heart. And before we ask these questions, I want to just gently and authentically talk about our struggles with mental health. Mental health struggles for many are a very tremendous disability and a tremendous impacting disability in all of life. I know that mental health struggles vary in depth and severity, but they are very real. They are part of most of our family's stories. And I would even I would even have us think about if we would bring out a mental health microscope and we would look at the core um, beginnings of every thought we have, every feeling we have, every word we say, that we would all discover that there's some degree of mental health, some depression, some anxiety, some worry, some trauma that has um, impacted our way of thinking, which impacts our behavior. As we ask these questions today, I want to ask them in gentleness. And I'm aware that mental health struggles are very much a part of many of the stories in our church and in many of our families. And I want us to have an awareness of this struggle, but I don't want us to take ourselves off the hook for asking spiritually true questions of our own heart. So if we will participate in what God has for us and we would exchange comparison for being searchable, we would exchange comparison that fixes my eyes and my thoughts on me for being searchable, where all of me is available to all of God, then we can ask these spiritually true questions. I've two daughters who've grown into beautiful young women, and during their stories, they have both endured times of struggle and trial. And part of encouraging them in those seasons was to encourage their character as they walked through times of pain and hardship. Even the hardship of a normal disappointment during a normal day, I would remind them that we participate in what gets to fill our heart. And today, they remind me of that and encourage me in moments when I need to be reminded that I participate in what fills my heart. So I would often mention, and they now mention to me, that the choice we have when hardship and suffering comes, when life hits us, the choice we have is it an ordeal or is it an adventure? If you put your hope on your own strength, on your own plans, on your own wisdom, and things don't work as you expected, then you can quickly enter into an ordeal. But if you will put your hope in God, who is always at work for your eternal good, then you will begin to walk in adventure with the God who raises the dead. An ordeal is something that you dread, an adventure is something that you have with God. So we ask this spiritually and emotionally true question when trouble hits us. Is it an ordeal or is it an adventure? Warren Wiersbe says it this way. He writes, "What life does to us depends on what life finds in us." What life does to us depends on what life finds in us. If you look at the evidence of your own life, your own experiences, you'll see that this is true. And this is part of how you can preach to yourself. You are always part of your own story. You're always part of the drama that is your life. You are always there. And even if you have a well-crafted narrative that blames other people or other organizations, no matter how you tell the story, you are always part of it. And if there's people in your life that you love, then it's worth exchanging comparison for being searchable and allowing God to ask this question when you are walking into seasons of suffering and affliction. Is it an ordeal or is it an adventure? Now, as you walk in an adventure, you will still have times of suffering. There will still be moments of grief. There will be moments when we are discouraged or we're disappointed, but we can remain searchable in those moments. We can come to that place like Paul did, where those moments reveal to us these things happen so that we can see that we cannot rely on our own strength. We cannot rely on ourselves, but we rely only on God who raises the dead. If you choose ordeal when suffering and affliction hits your life, then you're choosing a path that leads through suffering that is hopeless. An ordeal leads you through suffering in waves of continued being overwhelmed and just plodding through the mud of discouragement. This always happens to me. Life is always like this. Eyes only looking at our own feelings and our own circumstances. Fixing our thoughts on how I feel, how I feel, how I feel. There's no margin or room for the possibility of God's comfort when I'm in an ordeal. But if you answer this spiritually true question, is it an ordeal or an adventure? If you will risk stepping into an adventure with God, even if you experiment with this and the first times are just, it's an adventure. Even if you will just move in that direction, that there is the possibility during this suffering that God has supernatural comfort for you, to equip you and to create you into a comforter, that He has a peace for you that the Bible describes as a peace that is beyond our understanding or description. If we would just be searchable and risk this, take the step in adventure, and adventure leads you through suffering with hope in God who raises the dead. This is a hope that no matter what happens to me, no matter what I feel or what my circumstances are, I rely on a God who is at work for my eternal good all the way through my physical resurrection on the final day. Is it an ordeal or is it an adventure? There's no comfort in an ordeal because our hope is set on our feelings changing or our circumstances changing. But there is comfort from God in an adventure because our hope is set on God alone. Paul writes to the Corinthian church and to us, he wants to rescue us from this ordeal trap, invite us into this adventure of life with God, the adventure of relying on God. Paul, speaking out of his own experience and his own struggles, his own personal heartaches, he has endured physically suffering almost to the point of death several times over. And Paul writes in our passage today, just hear this again, we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about the troubles we experienced in the province of Asia. We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt we received the sentence of death. This is Paul pouring out his heart. This is how they felt. This was the end of their selves, physically, emotionally. This is it. And then he has this revelation, this lifting his eyes from himself to see the possibility of God's hope. He says, but this happened. We felt this way that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. This is the adventure of life with God. Paul does not rely on himself. He doesn't rely on his ability, his wisdom. He doesn't rely on his strength. Paul doesn't rely on money. Paul doesn't rely on his credentials. Paul doesn't rely on people. Paul doesn't rely on government. Paul doesn't rely on anyone, organization bailing him out. He doesn't rely on technology. He doesn't rely on any created thing. He relies on God who raises the dead. He continues in the same passage in verse 10, 2 Corinthians 1:10. The end of that verse, he says, on him we have set our hope that he will continue to deliver us. Paul's heart is set on God, and Paul's heart is filled with the things of God, so that when he is pressed, when his heart is pressed in struggle and affliction, the things of God come out. Comfort that he has received from God comes out of his heart when he's pressed. Kindness that he's received from God comes out of his heart when he is pressed in suffering and affliction. And notice this, God is not Paul's emergency plan. God is the plan. Paul navigated these terrible circumstances, and in the midst of them, and in the midst of the heartache he felt from this harsh criticism from people he loved, in the midst of all of this affliction and suffering, he writes this great letter that is a letter of encouragement, love, and kindness. What's in Paul's heart is what comes out when he is pressed. He relies on God. His strength is from God. His wisdom is from God. His trust in his God. His hope is in God. No matter what he feels or what his circumstances are, his hope is anchored in God, who is unchanging, unmoving, always steadfast and faithful. And in miraculous ways, the Holy Spirit inspires Paul to write this letter with a compassionate heart. It is astounding that Paul doesn't lash out at anyone. And if we look at his other letters, we never see Paul lashing out on those who cause suffering or heartache. One time he mentions a blacksmith who did him great harm, but he doesn't lash out. He doesn't tear into people. He doesn't retaliate for their offense, for their hurt, for the heartache, for the suffering, because what's in his heart is what comes out when he is pressed. This is how Paul can later write in this same letter. This is jumping ahead, 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 8. Paul writes, and I want you to hear this emotionally true and spiritually true question being answered in every statement. Is it an ordeal or an adventure? Paul writes, 2 Corinthians 4, verse 8, we are hard pressed on every side. And he answers the question, is it an ordeal or an adventure? And he says, but not crushed. It's not an ordeal. There is suffering. It is a testimony. We are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed. We are perplexed. We don't understand. We're confused, but not in despair. He's choosing the adventure with God. He's choosing to rely on God, to trust on God. We are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed. Perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not abandoned. Struck down, but not destroyed. He is testifying that in every one of these moments of suffering and affliction and heartache, that he is answering this spiritually true question, is it an ordeal or an adventure? He is choosing the adventure with God.